I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
On the third Monday in January, Americans celebrate Martin Luther King Day. We honor a great African-American leader who worked for freedom for all people. Who is this man who has a national holiday in his name? He is Martin Luther King Jr., was born in Atlanta, Georgia on January 15, 1929. His father was a Baptist minister and his mother was a teacher. Martin grew up in a busy and loving family. They live in the South, and there African Americans had always lived under laws that were unfair to them. Before the Civil War, most African Americans had been slaves to white owners. During this war, President Abraham Lincoln granted freedom to slaves by passing a special law. But even though the slaves were free from slavery, Southern lawmakers passed new laws to keep them separate or segregated from white people. These laws were called Jim Crow laws, and they deprived African Americans of many rights. African American children went to separate poorer schools than white children. On buses, African Americans had to sit in the back seats. African Americans were forced to use public drinking fountains and restrooms marked for color only. In early days, African Americans were called colored. As Martin grew up, he learned from his parents and his teachers that the laws calling for segregation were unfair. African Americans were suffering from not having equal rights. Martin wanted to help the African American people gain full freedom. He wanted to work for civil rights, for full legal, social, and economic equality. Martin was a British student who went to college near home in Atlanta at age 15. He decided when he was 19 that he would be a Baptist minister like his father. He had read about Mohandas Gandhi, the great leader from India. Gandhi believed in using love, not hate, to stop injustice. Martin decided he wanted to use peaceful, non-violent ways to help his people. While he was studying, Martin met his future wife. She was starting to become a singer, and on the first date, Martin told Coretta he wanted to marry her. He liked her for her beliefs and their commitment to equality, as well as her beauty. In the summer of 1953, they got married. A year later, Martin took his first preaching job at a Baptist church in Montgomery, Alabama. In 1954, the United States Supreme Court ruled that schools could not be segregated or divided by race. The court ordered that schools should be integrated. This meant that all races should be able to attend the school of their choice. With this important ruling, African Americans became very hopeful that they could change society. Martin and other leaders encouraged people to work together peacefully to win civil rights for everyone, regardless of their race or allegiance. Although some white people were not happy with the Supreme Court ruling. But at the same time, a small secret group of white people called the Ku Klux Klan tried to prevent African Americans from having equal rights. Often, their actions were violent. Many other Southern white people, while not violent, were not in favor of integration, and many white people from the South and the North support integration and full equality for African Americans. In December 1935, something important happened in Montgomery, where Martin and his family were living. An African American woman named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white man. She was arrested. The African American citizens of the city were outraged and they decided to protest. This kind of protest, where people refuse to participate in something in order to force a change, is called a boycott. Martin became the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott. People supported the boycott by walking or carpooling, but they would not ride the bus. For over a year, the boycott went on. The city would not change the segregation law. Many angry threats were made to Martin and his family. Once, their house was bombed. But in November 1956, the boycott ended in victory for the Africans. Violent acts continued against African Americans in the South. Several churches were firebombed in Montgomery. Martin spoke out, "We will not hate you, but we will not obey your evil laws." Courageous African Americans started to test the unfair laws of segregation. In 1960, small groups of students began sit-ins in lounge counters where only white people could be served. The next year, a group of African Americans and white Americans called the Freedom Riders rode together on buses through the southern states. They wanted to put the new law banning segregation to a test. When they got to Alabama, violent gangs of Southerners, including members of the Ku Klux Klan, burned the buses and attacked the riders. The local police offered little protection, but many people were hurt. In April of 1963, Martin led the famous Birmingham March to stop segregation in the city. The march was sprayed and many were seriously injured. More than 3,000 African Americans were arrested and jailed. Finally, the city ended its segregation laws. The media coverage of the violence in Birmingham made more and more people aware of the unfair and harsh treatments of African Americans. Martin called for a march on Washington for August 28, 1963. African Americans and many white Americans, numbering over 250,000, walked from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial. They were marching for freedom, rights, and dignity for all people. The cheering crowd heard Martin give his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. The next struggle for African Americans was for voting rights. In the South, many African Americans had been prevented from registering to vote. Registering meant that people had to prove they were entitled to vote. Registration was made difficult. Martin later called for the Poor People's Campaign. The goal was to get better homes, schools, and jobs for African Americans. In the spring of 1968, he went to help out on a strike held by the garbage collectors in Memphis, Tennessee. While in Memphis, Martin was killed by an assassin's bullet. He died on April 4, 1968, at the age of 39. The whole world mourned the death of this great man of peace. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is remembered for making real the dream of equality, and he is remembered for being a man of peace and a champion of rights and freedom for people of every color.
Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.